You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I have a really interesting guest. Her name is Nelson-Dooley. I encountered her because I'm reading her book, Your Oral Microbiome. She's an MS. She studied medicinal plants in the rainforest of Panama, which is really cool. 2003, she was a Fulbright scholar, and she launched a career in science and natural medicine. She's researched the pharmacology of medicinal plants at University of Georgia and AptoTec, Inc., and then joined the innovators at Metametrix Clinical Laboratory and Genova Diagnostics. She enjoys teaching and presenting and writing and researching how to address the underlying causes of disease, thankfully, instead of the symptoms. So, Cass, thanks for coming. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me today, Richard.
Yeah, you've got a really interesting background. Maybe we can start. What got you interested in, studying medicinal plants? Because that's a pretty rare thing nowadays, it seems like.
Yeah. Well, I think there's kind of a, family roots in that. I think my grandfather and my mom, and I think really just my parents were always kind of interested in natural medicine. We've, just in my family, we kind of have this culture where we're a little bit reluctant, we're always careful before getting into aggressive treatments, and looking for more gentle treatments and looking for underlying causes, so there was that. And you probably remember, probably in the 90s, there was a lot of interest in medicinal plants. And I particularly was interested in medicinal plants as for drug discovery, for finding, the cure to cancer, basically, looking for novel compounds from nature, because there's nothing more, complex and bioactive than things that come from nature. And so I was really interested in looking for, the next new drug that could potentially cure a serious disease like cancer. So that's what got me into it. And I ended up in the rainforest of Panama studying medicinal plants. So it was a blast.
Yeah, that's interesting. Did you study how indigenous populations use them and
Yeah.
For hundreds of years? Tell me about that.
Yeah, I sure did. So I was living on an island, Bostimentes Island, off the coast of Panama, and this is on the Caribbean side of Panama. So it was a little bit like doing research in paradise, But I lived on an island where two different communities lived. There was an Afro-Caribbean community, which had they were descendants from Jamaican immigrants. And then there was an indigenous group called the Ngabe Indians. And so I studied the medicinal plants that both they lived on the same island in different locations, but I was interested in the medicinal plants that both were using for common illnesses and comparing those. And one of the things I found out was that even though they lived on the same island, they were using totally different plants from one another. So it was really interesting. And of course, they had different medicine systems too. The indigenous people had more of like a shaman or a medicine man who was kind of controlled the medical knowledge. And the Afro-Caribbean community, it was more like everybody knew it. The grandparents, the kids, everybody in the community knew about medicinal plants. So it was a really fun and interesting experience.
What are some examples of how they use medicinal plants? In our culture, anyone has a sniffle, they'll try to get antibiotics. But what's an example or two of how these cultures would use plants and in what context?
Yeah, well, the Afro-Caribbean, I mean, really the medicinal plants used in the Afro-Caribbean community was pretty impressive. They had, I mean, really, there were many, many medicinal plants just kind of growing out of the sidewalk, growing at the sides of the houses. Like I said, little kids could name them. Grandparents. I mean, there were kind of medicine women who were recognized for having more knowledge than other people in the community. But so certainly, I mean, the most common is to make a tea. To make a tea it's like if you have a cold or if you have like a skin lesion, like a sore, which is common in the tropics. Then now in that case they might be making like a poultice from the like mashing up the plant and applying it and bandaging it on. um tea is the most common. I mean, there was a lot of herbal tea, and I think it's actually kind of a nice lesson for all of us that what a healthy habit it is to drink herbal tea, because it gets a lot of plant nutrients and phytochemicals into our bodies easily. Just kind of sipping on herbal tea all day.
Okay. So typically in these cultures, someone would be sick, and would there be a medicine person, or would the whole community know which plants to look for, and then they would make a tea or a poultice, and the person would take that? And I mean, did you literally observe this in action? I hope you didn't, but maybe you got sick, or someone you saw was sick and someone helped.
Yeah. Well, one of the medicines that I studied in depth was called the black drink. So this was kind of a specialty medicine, and it was so like you said, everybody in the community knew like the basic medicinal plants that could help get them well. Like in something common like a cold. Like, just like we might take vitamin C or, do certain things when we get a cold or feel one coming on. That was kind of like how their community was. But for special problems or really severe problems, then they would go to, I would call her like a medicine woman. These were two, kind of grandmother-like females in the community that really had a lot, like decades of knowledge about medicine and plants. And they were considered experts in the community. But one of the treatments that they used was it was called black drink, and it was really for what they called low blood, which is the equivalent of like iron deficiency anemia. Pallid fingernails and pallor and fatigue and things like that. So they would cook up this black drink that had a couple of herbs. It was boiled with broken cast iron pots in it. And so they would boil this mixture for a couple of days, and it would come out like black liquid. And I observed the cooking and everything, the preparations. And then they would have the person take it with a little bit of wine as a treatment. And I was able to take a sample of it and analyze it back in the lab at the University of Georgia. And indeed, it was chock full of iron. So it was, and it was actually potentially treating iron deficiency anemia, which is exactly what they were saying it was, treating low blood symptoms. And the herbs that they used in it were actually anti-parasitic herbs. And that was relevant because, having parasites can cause iron deficiency anemia. So it was a really interesting kind of the evidence behind the folk medicine learning the pharmacology. Yeah, learning the pharmacology and the evidence behind something that we, some people might think of as just, old wives' tale,
Yeah. But how are we supposed to reconcile plant medicine with, Western medicine? It seems like Eastern medicine, they use plants quite a bit more. I'm an outsider. I really don't know, but it just seems like it. But how do you think this could be added into Western medicine, or is it too at odds, unfortunately?
Well, I think they can be used together, definitely. I work more in the integrative and functional medicine field, and so I work with a lot of clinicians who are using both. I mean, they might be using pharmaceuticals when it's seriously a serious or grave situation where something very powerful is needed to intervene, and then they might be using herbs when they're trying to make kind of more kind of gentle or holistic shifts in a person's health. So I do think they can be used together. I mean, I don't, obviously the mainstream medical model, people who have been to, a mainstream medical school and haven't done any other, training in integrative medicine or alternative medicine or anything, they're not going to be too familiar with using herbs in practice. So, but I think we're going that direction. I think Americans, and I think it's all over the world, but certainly Americans. I mean, there's a huge demand for more herbal medicine, for more nutritional medicine, and I think that's where we're going. It's just not in every doctor's office yet.
Well, I mean, from what I've been told, big pharma, at best, they'll try to isolate one compound from a plant's medicine and then patent that, a molecule similar to that. And then that's the westernized version of it. But
that's right.
One interesting thing, these plant medicines, you're not just getting compound X, you're getting a whole host of associated compounds with it. So, I know it would make it hard to maybe figure out the specific compound that would be helping you, but I don't know, what's your sense of what that does, all these other compounds besides the one supposedly that's doing the healing or doing the helping? What role do you think they have to play?
Oh, no, I think that they have, I mean, any one plant can have hundreds or thousands of plant chemicals, and they can work synergistically. So, I mean, yes, there might be one compound that's very active. It has, that in a pharmaceutical might be an active ingredient, but there's that. But there's all of these other plant compounds as well that can be very can have all kinds of biological activity on us when we eat it. Just like food, it's like it's a package. It's a package. It's not just a single isolated ingredient. So, plant chemicals are, they can't. I mean, some of the common things, the common biological activity is that they are, anti-inflammatory, or they are anti-cancer, or they are antimicrobial. Because plants, need these protections within them. They produce these chemicals to try to help protect them, right? Because a plant can't move like we can. They can't move away from danger. So they have to produce, compounds, metabolites that will protect them from bacteria and fungus and parasites and harsh weather and all these things. So when we eat them, I mean, we can get a lot of beneficial, healthy effects. And so I think, I don't completely shoot down the approach of finding a single ingredient, because sometimes you do need a single ingredient at really high doses to get a change for somebody. But I think if you can get away with using a lower dose, a more gentle dose with in that plant package that's more like a whole food or more like a whole plant, then that's that's definitely better for your body. And they won't have the side effects likely.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about, metformin. It depletes your B12, for instance. And I know other drugs can cause depletions or changes in other, constituents of our body. And I wonder if that's because they're not packaged with things that maybe they should be packaged with. Maybe that's what, for some reason, the plant just knows how to do. If it produces something, it also produces the necessary adjuncts that will either feed the microbiome associated with processing that chemical in your body, or prevent, other biomarkers from being depleted. Maybe that comes with the medicine. Maybe it's smart enough that all of that is packaged in with the main ingredient somehow.
Yeah, I mean, plants need vitamins and minerals. even though there's so many differences between us, between animals and plants, I mean, we kind of run on a lot of the same fuel. We need a lot of the same building blocks in order to have life, minerals, amino acids, vitamins, all these things. So yeah, plants do have a lot of great nutrients in there that we can take advantage of. And you're right that these pharmaceuticals, I don't know particularly metformin, but it's very common that they deplete nutrients. Very, very common. So, and I don't know the mechanisms whereby that's happening, but if you're on pharmaceutical treatments, or, as many people in our country, like a cocktail, like a couple, then you do have to really think about nutrient depletions. Like you really want to try to make up for that with, a good quality multivitamin mineral, and maybe even do testing to make sure that your nutrients aren't being overly depleted, because that's just making things worse, if you don't have the vital nutrients for health.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you could be taking a certain medication and a certain biomarker or nutrient is trending down, and you're taking the medication, let's say, for a year or 2 or 3 or 5 years, and that marker has trended down so much that now you start to get ancillary effects, which you may think, oh, the medication is not working, or I need now this other medication, when it may just be something simple like that.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I do think sometimes we just develop side effects from medications down the road, and it's hard to link it back. I mean, some doctors have to take their patients off of a couple of medications and then see how their patient comes to them sick and they're on 5 or 6 or more medications, and then obviously this is a doctor's call to try to take them off of medications, but sometimes that is helpful to just get the clear picture, because they can have, aside from depleting nutrients, they also have side effects. They really, really can change physiology, and it's not always for a good, not always in the right direction.
Yeah, in terms of plant medicine, again, I guess a lot of stuff's coming to mind. So I've heard that some plants, for instance, they can produce chemicals to, confuse ant invaders, or to call in predators of ants that would prey on them, or some other creature that would prey on them. So the plants seem to be intelligent, for lack of a better word, and can see and hear and, have like a senome where they can interact with their environment. Do you think that plants ever, maybe it's a ridiculous question, make medicine for us somehow? Do you think they could know that we are their caretaker and therefore make stuff for us? Or why would they make these compounds, you think?
Well, I kind of look at it more from an evolutionary perspective. I think that's a really neat question, and it gets more into, kind of, more like belief system, but I'm a scientist, so I really kind of tend to look at everything in terms of evolution. But these plants, we have evolved with them for millennia. So, when they make something like a fruit, fruit's a perfect example, right? We don't think much of it. We just eat the fruit. But plants are totally using us to spread their seed all over the earth, and that's through fruits, right? Because when you eat fruit, and in the old days when we didn't have, plumbing and everything, people would poop out the fruit seeds, and that would be like the perfect fertilizer and preparation for that seed to grow into a tree. So plants and humans, we are very, and you've probably read a lot about this. We're very like symbiotic organisms, and we've evolved together. And in terms of plants making these, what they call secondary metabolites, that is, I believe, something that helps plants survive. And that's why they've made these metabolites. And then many of them happen to benefit us, or we have helped select for these plants to reproduce and evolve and further survive, because, like, for instance, we like apples that are sweet, or we like, grapes that are this such a way. And the other piece to this whole like beautiful relationship between plants and humans is the relationship between plants and insects, which is vastly more complex and ancient. So really, plants and insects are the ones that blew up evolution for each other. So as insects were blowing up, that, as their, diversity of their species was just blossoming, blasting out, so were plants. And that's where you get lots of different flower types, lots of, I think what's there, like 200,000 species of plants and insects, and I can't quote the number of species of insects, but it's equally very diverse and very rich. And these plants and insects have very, intimate interactions where they help each other, reproduce and survive and pollinate. And it's just it's really mind blowing. It's really amazing.
Well, I was thinking, okay, so how many communities have you been in that use plant medicine? Was it just one, which is enough, but I'm just wondering if you went to other ones?
No, I really see people all over the world using plant medicine, but I particularly in Panama, I particularly studied two communities that, that's what I was interested in. But I did work with some anthropologists in Mexico who were studying medicinal plants in Chiapas. So I'm also familiar with, some other communities that were using plant medicine.
Well, what I was wondering is, wouldn't it be funny if the pharmacopoeia of the plants that are local to a given population, do they have a complete set of remedies for that population? And what if that was true? And what if that was true for other populations that you visited? It would kind of be suspiciously coincidental if that was the case, that plants that are local to this population just happen to have, medicines available for, the top 10 ailments they have. Did you see any of that, or have you given thought to that?
Yeah, I think you can pretty much safely assume, they definitely, but all communities that I mentioned had, the top 10 plants used to treat the top illnesses, and we're talking about the same illnesses that we have, colds, coughs, those are the common, stomach ache. These are the common things that bother all of us. They're not serious, but like you look for a remedy, but yeah, I think that's true. I think you're right.
Well, it's just kind of a strange coincidence. If that's the case, that's why. Like you were talking about fruits. So fine. Okay. It makes sense. The plant would make fruits knowing that creatures would eat the fruits and move around and poop out the seeds, and that would fertilize them. But if you think, how would the plant know to do that? Because it's outside of its own body. How would it even know that there are creatures out there? But how would it know that? It's weird. It must have a pretty advanced sensory apparatus to be able to do that. I don't know if you can say plants see and hear, but it must have a pretty advanced sensory apparatus again in order to be able to do that, right?
Well, I know. I think the way we talk about it, we make it sound like the plant, has a brain or has some kind of cognitive function, but really what it is, in my view, is that plant, let's go back in evolution. That plant that made that first fruit that kind of tasted like an apple, that let's say that tree that made that first, prototype apple-like fruit. Well, some people came along and found that, or some animals came along and found that and ate it all up. And they went out and they distributed the seed all over the earth, all over the land nearby. And that apple, that prototype apple tree now had, 100 seedlings. So now those seedlings, so then those seedlings were later, those also had like an apple flavor. Animals liked it. Then they spread the seed further. So that's how that animal and plant interaction helps that apple tree, evolve and reproduce and, continue on, whereas other trees that were similar would have died off because they didn't have a fruit that had that delicious taste. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's the answer, but I guess these are just the thoughts coming to mind. It's just odd. I wonder why, these things happen. And to me, again, this is just me speaking, my opinion, but it doesn't seem chance alone is enough. But a random mutation. But again, that's
okay. Yeah. And that's where it's, kind of, I don't know if the word spirituality or belief, I mean, that's where that comes in more, and I think there are, for me, being a scientist, I mean, I do personally, have spiritual beliefs too. It's just that I still kind of rely on evolution as the tool that kind of made it all come into effect, happen. And so that's I know it's kind of dry and not very exciting, but yeah, that's how I see it happening. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, just because you had that firsthand experience, I don't know. That's why I wondered. And if you've had experience, have you had any experiences, scientific or not, that really just impacted you big time, being in those communities or just in your overall studies or clinical work? I mean, have you had any experiences that maybe you can explain or can't explain, but regardless, they just had like a big impact? They whacked you on the side of the head and changed how you thought about things.
Well, I guess I'll tell you about what's coming to mind, even though I'm not sure it's exactly what you're looking for, because it's not really related to the plant, the track of the conversation that we're having around plants and evolution and humans and insects and everything. But I did have an experience that pretty much turned my way of looking at the world upside down. And that was that I had a dear friend who she was in cancer treatment, and we were in communication, of course, and she ended up passing. She didn't survive. She had breast cancer, and she didn't survive the treatment. And she basically, I think it was a week or two after she passed, I got a text. I got a text in my phone. It was like I had written it. It was a text it was in that field that you type in before you're about to send it. But my phone had been locked. My phone had been locked for hours. I hadn't been near my phone, and I pick up my phone, and it's got a text in it, as though I had written it, but it was a text that she had sent me, months earlier. So, and it was a very clear, loving message about, she said something to the effect of, I'm doing fine. Please call my husband. It still gives me chills, the story. Please call my husband.
Sure.
I can't remember what she was telling me to tell her husband. And she said, love you, BFF, or something like that. And I mean, I can't tell you the chills that were rolling through me for hours. I could not explain. I'm a scientist, and I don't spend a lot of time thinking about, other planes of, the other parts that we can't, the parts of the universe that we don't see, and taste and touch and feel, I mean, I do believe that there's more to it, but I don't know what it is exactly. And I could not explain how this happened. And of course I contacted her husband, and I told her that I had felt that I'd gotten a message from her, and that I could not explain how it happened. Yeah. But anyway, it was a game changer for me. And it made me realize how little any of us really know, and that there's more going on below the surface. But yeah.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I didn't, I wasn't trying to take you maybe that far in the direction, but I just wondered again, maybe if there's I was wondering if there's a more boring science-based story that we had the same reaction though.
That might be more along the lines of what we were talking about.
Sometimes I feel like that where I'll discover something and it's just, I don't know, it just gives me a weird feeling. It's like, how could that be? Science, even to me, science is like that a lot of times. So that's why I ask.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to think of something that, I mean, I feel like I get those a lot. I wish I could kind of think of something that's really like, kind of like getting hit over the head with a 2x4 in terms of the excitement. I mean,
well, let's go there in a different direction. So,
okay, sure.
So you mentioned, for instance, insects and how they relate to plants is amazingly complex and interesting. So what are some things you've discovered there that people would like to know about?
Yeah, well, let's take a different topic because insects and
Sure.
plants are not actually my forte. I mean, I think it's totally mind blowing, but I already kind of shared the part that I think is so mind blowing about them. But we could talk. I could give you like maybe an example about the
Well,
microbiome and
yeah, that's what I was
humans,
going to say,
or
right? I haven't
yeah,
asked you about your book. I apologize. So let's talk about
no,
that.
no
Like,
problem.
what you wrote a book, Heal Your Oral Microbiome. Where did that come from? Like, what prompted you to do that?
Yeah, so I have a lot of history and background in microbiome testing, stool testing. I've spent a lot of years working for diagnostic laboratories, and back, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, one of the companies I worked for pioneered the first stool test that measured the microbes in the gut using DNA analysis. So that was a huge, a huge step, innovative step. And, I had a lot of experience looking over tests and understanding the gut microbiome in humans, which of course a lot of people know about now. It's, kind of old news now. Well, I was given a task to write a paper on the oral microbiome from one of my clients. I have a health education business and a medical writing business, and that was one of my assignments for one of my clients who does education for their clients, for their physician clients. And it just was amazing. It was amazing because all of the exciting, amazing things that we know about the gut microbiome is reflected and similar with the oral microbiome, although the oral microbiome doesn't get all the press yet. So, and I think the oral microbiome, so I mean, just to lay out a few things that the microbiome does for us, it, makes vitamins. It helps us digest and absorb food. It calms down inflammation. It informs the immune system and helps the immune system kind of learn how to act, who's a bad guy and who's a good guy. I mean, the list goes on and on. And but those are some of the most important. It helps protect, actually protect mucosal surfaces of your body from the outside world too. So it helps protect us from pathogens. So our good bacteria help protect us from infections. And so all of that's also happening in the mouth. And the mouth is so interesting because you're constantly eating and drinking and swallowing the microbes from your mouth into the gut. So why haven't we been talking about it all this time? It's pretty important. It's the second, it's the second most biodiverse microbiome in our body, second only to the gut. So the mouth is a pretty interesting place to study.
Right. So whenever we eat, I wonder a couple of things. So I wonder, we eat, and when food's in our mouth, if the, our somatic cells are probably very likely communicating to the rest of our body, hey, there's food, it appears to be of this nature, et cetera, it's here. But then the microbes themselves, not only are they being entrained in the food and brought into the gut, but perhaps they're communicating as well. Like, I've learned that microbes communicate, through the vagus nerve, supposedly with the brain. So maybe it's not far-fetched that they would also communicate this way with other microbial populations and let them know, what's coming, or maybe just by the fact that they're entrained with the food and they do arrive in the gut, that they can tell the gut, hey, this is what's coming and this is what's here, and here's our, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what else to say about it, but these are just thoughts.
Well, I think that's an interesting point. I can't speak to that. We do know that bacteria have quorum sensing. So, they basically, like a lot of different bacteria can act like an organism together. So they definitely have the ability to communicate, to share resources. They can say, hey, let's all work together and emit this chemical so that those other bugs can't get rid of us, So that's called quorum sensing, but that's one of those just sci-fi qualities that microbes have that we've only been talking about for the last 10 years or so. But yeah, so the bacteria, microbes come in on the food, but they also live on the teeth, underneath the gums, on the cheeks and the saliva, on the tongue. I mean, there's 5 or 6 different little ecological niches of microbes in our mouths. It's very specialized. And so we're swallowing those all day long into the gut as well, like the ones that are living in our mouths as well as the ones that are coming in through the food too.
Yeah, how does it, a lot of people talk about dysbiosis, but I don't know, how would a population know that it's the right mix or the wrong mix? From my reading of your book and other books, a very high number have what we would consider to be quote unquote bad bacteria, even in healthy individuals. But because I guess the quote unquote good bacteria are more prevalent in their mix, that they're okay, they don't have dysbiosis. So
right.
What is dysbiosis? It seems like a community type thing, and how is it decided?
Well, that's an awesome question, Richard, because it's not easy. I mean, I think it's a tough question. I think what I would say is that dysbiosis is an imbalance of a person's microbes that are related to symptoms or illness, because you're exactly right. I mean, someone can have dysbiosis on a test, like for instance, a stool test or an oral microbiome test, and they may have great health. They may be feeling great and have no symptoms, in which case you would say that people can have dysbiosis. They can have a test, for example, that shows they have dysbiosis, like a stool test or an oral microbiome test that shows they have microbial dysbiosis on paper, but if they have no symptoms at all and they're feeling great, then I would not call that dysbiosis,
Right.
And it's tricky because if you have a great, healthy microbiome, then you are going to be protected from pathogens. And we know that there are plenty of healthy people walking around with pathogens in their mouth or in their gut, and they're not having any trouble because their good bacteria are protecting them.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. Is anyone doing a study where they would, let's say, swab someone's mouth before and after they eat, and then in the day and in the night to see diurnal variation, and then over a period of weeks or months to see the change in their oral microbiome, for instance, because it's very accessible.
Yeah.
Has that kind of thing been done?
Yeah, some of it has. I mean, I think the research is still in its infancy, but like, for instance, they've done studies where they say, okay, let's look at the oral microbiome of these people, and then let's have them not brush their teeth for 10 days. And let's look at their oral microbiome again, And of course, it's a big mess. So, because bacteria are going to overgrow in that situation. So, yeah, there are studies looking at that. I mean, the famous microbe called Streptococcus mutans, that's one that we have been, it's kind of infamously responsible for cavities. And so there are studies that will show that if people chew up probiotics in their mouth, that bacteria will go down. So they'll test them beforehand, they'll test them afterwards, and they'll find that the bacteria that is partly responsible for cavities will decrease, for example. So we do have some studies, but not as much as we might like.
Yeah, it's just weird. I don't know how the microbial community in a given area has a sense of self, as it seems to. I mean, beyond quorum sensing, this seems like more to me. Because how would you know that, these, 12 species are the front runners, they're the most predominant. Yeah, we have these other ones, but there are very few of them, and we prefer as a community to keep those, to low levels.
Yeah.
And the community seems to, again, have a sense of that. Otherwise, why would it be sustainable for, a long period of time and come along with health of that organism? The organisms seem to have preferred states, and so do their microbial communities. And if let's say if you looked at the oral microbiome of the tongue of 1,000 people, how different would it be? And if it is pretty similar, why that particular mix, and why does that constitute health?
Yeah, I mean, those are good questions. And what we know about like in that scenario that you mentioned, like looking at the microbiome of 1,000 people of the tongue, they will all be different. So there's a lot of variability, one person to the next. But the core microbes that are present, like the actual, microbes that are there, will be similar. Like, for instance, microbe A, B, and C will be present on all 1,000 people, but in different amounts, for example, like that. And then there will be some that will be unique, So the core players are common throughout, like, everybody, but then there's a lot of variety, so much variety that we really can't say what does a healthy result look like. And it's the same for the gut microbiome. And there's a lot more research on that. But we can't just say, oh, this is a healthy gut microbiome. Everyone should try to go for this. Well, that's not true. We can't say that because there's a lot of unique variability, one person to the next.
Well, what if we were to, again, sample someone's oral microbiome, a whole bunch of times when they're healthy, and then when they get sick, sample it again and look for the differences? Maybe that would be a way to see, okay, if we restore this and that and change these numbers back, then that they were fine before, they should be okay now.
Yes, exactly. And what I encourage people to do is to, I think what we're moving forward, I know this podcast is about, future and technology and, optimizing health. But one of the things I think we're moving toward with testing is using ourselves as a baseline, and that really, we should test ourselves when we're in our 20s in, quote, top health. And then, compare as we age and as we develop health problems, then test ourselves and compare it to the baseline that was done at the top of health. So I think that's where we're going. That's where we should go because of all the variability from one human being to another and the variability of their microbiome and, all genetics and all of these factors that influence our health status. So kind of using ourselves as our own measuring stick,
Right, exactly. Yeah. And it's weird, and it seems like once we get to a stable configuration of a given population, we have a resistance to that population changing, right?
You mean like a microbial population?
Right. Yeah, like if my mouth has X numbers of bacteria in these amounts, it tends to stay that way from what I understand. It has a stability to it for some reason.
Oh, yeah. It will stay that way unless you take medication, unless you change your diet. And there's a few other things like pH. If a few things change, it can really shift the microbiome. But if most things stay the same, then it's very stable. Obviously, antibiotics can wipe things out.
Right. It's just interesting that it's stable in the first place. Why is it stable?
Yeah.
I know these are very difficult questions, but it's just interesting that it can do such a thing.
It is. It's fascinating. And, I think, we were talking about kind of this ancient relationship between, plants and insects and human and plants. Well, humans and bacteria, that's an ancient one. That's a very ancient, relationship. So, bacteria probably figured this out like, 1 billion years ago because they were on the planet 3 billion years before we were. So they had a good head start on, figuring out how to keep their community stable and how to take hold and not let go, and not get washed away or brushed away or, to how to stick.
Yeah, well, that's true. Well, I guess there's a million more questions I could ask you, but we're getting close to running out of time. So we didn't cover this very much, but I guess you're doing naturopathic consulting functional medicine consulting right now. Can you just give a call to action for people that want to learn more and maybe get in touch and get help from you personally, if that's available?
Sure, absolutely. So I do medical writing and medical education. My company is healthfirstconsulting.com, healthfirstconsulting.com. And, I do consulting, obviously, on test results if people want, a one-on-one call about their test results and action items. So, yeah, I would love for people to reach out. My email is CassNelson-Dooley @gmail.com, CassNelson-Dooley.com. And, at gmail.com. And, just would be interested in, like I said, the main focus of my work is to improve health worldwide. So I'm interested in doing that in a lot of different ways. I also have patient education videos. I have videos on my website related to leaky gut and stool testing and food sensitivity testing for educational purposes too.
That's great. Well, Cass, thanks for coming on the call. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's been a pleasure.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.